12 years, the most productive 12 years of a man's life spent behind iron bars for a crime he did not commit. DNA finally screamed his innocence, but the darkest part of this story was not his release. It was the moment the identity of the real killer came to light, confronting the court with a far deeper, far more unsettling truth. Sometimes the monster the world fears is the very person it once watched mourn the victim, applauded, and trusted without question. The Cook County Courthouse greeted arrivals with an unusual stillness, even on an ordinary Tuesday morning. This was a hearing not about an accusation, but about the correction of an error, and the courthouse halls seemed to still carry the weight of an injustice that had unfolded within those very walls 12 years earlier. In the front row sat a man dressed not in prison garb, but in a plain navy suit, Marcus Webb, 41 years old. 12 years earlier, at the age of 29, he had been convicted of a murder he did not commit. Now, released on bail, he waited for perhaps the most important hearing of his life, the one that would clear his name. His hands lay clasped on the table before him, held with a stiffness that seemed to carry the memory of handcuffs, no longer visible, but still somehow felt. Every so often, without quite realizing it, he rubbed his right wrist with his left hand, a 12-year habit that did not vanish in a single day. At the back of the room sat courthouse reporters and a camera from a local news station. This case was not simply one man's story, but part of a broader investigation into the re-examination of old DNA kits sitting in the state's forensic laboratories. Everyone wondered how many more names this hearing might ultimately bring to light. 12 years earlier, on a winter night in 2012, 24-year-old Emily Carter had been found dead in her own apartment. The investigation moved quickly, perhaps too quickly. Relying on the statement of her fiancé, Ryan Doyle, who had been the first to arrive at the scene, police identified a neighbor living in the same building, Marcus Webb, as their suspect. The case had been built on 3 pillars. Ryan Doyle's statement that he had seen Marcus running from the building on the night of the murder, a partial fingerprint recovered at the scene that the technology of the time could not conclusively analyze, and the testimony of a jailhouse informant who claimed Marcus had confessed while in custody. After 4 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict. At the time, no one questioned how fragile those 3 pillars truly were. The fingerprint had never been a definitive match. It had only been described as not excluded. The informant had testified in exchange for a reduced sentence, a fact that reached the defense only after the jury had already reached its verdict. And Ryan Doyle's identification had been made that night, from 50 meters away, across a snow-covered sidewalk, under the weak glow of a street lamp. But something that could not be tested in 2012 had remained preserved all along. A tissue sample taken from beneath Emily's fingernails, one that the technology of the time had failed to resolve. Years later, through the persistent efforts of a legal clinic, that sample was finally retested, and the result was about to shake the entire foundation of the case. When Marcus took the stand, his voice was calm, but that calm did not come from peace. It came from 12 years of learned control. Petition attorney Alan Mercer's first question was simple. "Mr. Webb, can you tell us about the 12 years you lost?" Marcus paused for a moment, then began to speak, not with an outburst of anger, not with lament, but simply with the weight of fact. He had attended his father's funeral in handcuffs, under guard, allowed 5 minutes beside the casket. His daughter had been 4 years old when he was arrested. She was now a 16-year-old young woman who barely knew her father. In prison, Marcus had earned a construction certification, helped establish a library, and searched every night for a path to prove his innocence, sometimes with hope, most often without. His voice trembled once, only once, when he spoke of his daughter. "The last time I saw her, she was 4, he said. "Now she looks at me like a stranger. That's another thing this case took, something no verdict can ever give back." The room remained silent for a long moment after that sentence. When Assistant State's Attorney Diane Foster rose, her voice was neither hostile nor warm, only cautious. "Your Honor, The state acknowledges the seriousness of the new DNA evidence, but this court must not act in haste. The tissue sample beneath the fingernails could belong to a third party, from consensual contact, perhaps even from a day before the murder itself. Mercer answered sharply, "Your Honor, this tissue sample consisted of skin cells the victim scraped away while defending herself. The forensic pathologist stated that plainly. This is not incidental contact. It is the mark of a struggle." Foster did not retreat. Then why might Mr. Webb's DNA still remain consistent with the other evidence at the scene, the partial fingerprint? That question briefly allowed a small crumb of doubt to sprout again in the room. What if Marcus really had been at the scene, but not alone? What if the crime had been the work of two people, not one? The audience's conscience, just as it had settled into certainty of innocence, felt a slight tremor, small but genuine hesitation. Marcus answered from the stand without raising his voice. "I have asked myself that same question for 12 years, Ms. Foster. The answer hasn't changed. I was never in that apartment that night. The fingerprint could have been left in the building's shared hallway. I lived there. But I was never inside Emily's apartment." His words were simple, but the certainty in his tone extinguished part of the doubt that had just taken hold in the room. When the courtroom door opened, every head turned in the same direction. The man who entered looked very different from his photographs of 12 years earlier, now gray-haired, dressed in a gray suit, wearing a local fire department commendation pin on his lapel. A respected man. Ryan Doyle, Emily Carter's former fiancé, had been remembered throughout the original trial as the grieving sweetheart. Now he was a hero the community trusted. As Doyle settled into the witness stand, his voice was warm and controlled, the voice of a hero. "I still remember what I saw 12 years ago," he said, narrowing his eyes as though reliving that night. "Finding Emily, it's a moment I will never be able to forget. And when I stepped outside, I saw Marcus running away from the building. I never had any doubt about that." Many people in the room nodded slightly as they listened to Doyle's account. The same warmth, the same sincerity that had convinced the court 12 years earlier was still there. Even with the years that had passed, Ryan Doyle's story still looked like the story of a hero, a man who had endured loss, yet continued serving his community. When Mercer began his cross-examination, his first question seemed gentle, but no one expected the blow it would soon deliver. "Mr. Doyle, in your original statement to police, you described the man fleeing that night as maybe Marcus, I'm not sure. But in your statement 3 days later, that became definitely Marcus. Can you explain that change?" A slight tension appeared on Doyle's face, but his voice remained controlled. "I was in shock during my first statement. I had time to think afterward, and my memory became clearer." Mercer nodded, his voice still calm. "Memories don't usually sharpen over time, Mr. Doyle. They usually blur. Yet yours sharpened at precisely the moment police were focusing on a suspect. An interesting coincidence, wouldn't you say?" The questions accelerated. Why had he waited 20 minutes that night before calling the police? Why had there been a small scratch on his hands, noted in the incident report? Why did his cell phone records from that time show his signal coming from inside the building itself, not from outside it, in the moments just before the incident? Doyle answered every question, but the silences between his answers were beginning to stretch longer. The room was no longer watching a witness. It was watching a verbal brawl between two men, one throwing his questions like a series of punches, the other trying to block each one, each block landing weaker than the last. For the first time, a thin sheen of sweat appeared on Doyle's forehead. When forensic DNA analyst Dr. Priya Anand took the stand, the room settled into a different kind of tension, not emotional, but technical. Anand explained that the fingernail sample had been retested using modern STR analysis, the resulting profile uploaded to the state's CODIS database, and had returned an automated cold hit. The term cold hit echoed briefly through the room. It meant the sample had matched, by database search, the profile of someone already on record, perhaps from a prior arrest, perhaps from a routine DNA collection. As Anand opened the file, everyone in the room was asking the same question. Whose name would it turn out to be? Judge Choi ordered that the file first be reviewed in chambers before being disclosed in open court. That procedural pause stretched the tension in the room to nearly unbearable levels. Marcus leaned slightly forward in his seat. Mercer set down the pen in his hand, and Foster, for the first time, looked at the file with genuine curiosity of her own. Judge Choi opened the file before her and paused for a moment, as though weighing the gravity of the words she was about to speak. "This court will share this match in open session," she finally said. "The DNA profile matches a sample collected during a 2019 traffic stop. The owner of that sample is Mr. Ryan Michael Doyle." The room lost its breath in an instant. The man who had been celebrated as a hero only moments before was now the true owner of the tissue found beneath the victim's fingernails, the skin she had scraped away in self-defense before her death. The audience's conscience staggered for a second, and far more violent time. Ryan Doyle was no longer a grieving fiancé. He was now the true question mark at the center of the case. As every eye in the room turned to Doyle, something broke across his face. Only for an instant, but an instant everyone witnessed. His shoulders dropped slightly from their usual upright posture. His hands, resting on his knees, clenched into fists for the first time, and his eyes, unable to fix on any single point in the room, began to drift through empty space. Whispers rose from every corner of the room. Reporters bent over their laptops. For the first time, Marcus lost the fixed, controlled expression he had carried for 12 full years. What crossed his face was neither triumph nor rage. It was simply the weight of a truth he had waited a very long time to see confirmed. After a brief recess, Judge Choi recalled Doyle to the stand. This time not as a witness, but as a party invited to offer a voluntary statement. Mercer's first question was short. "Mr. Doyle, is there anything else you would like to say regarding Emily Carter's death?" Doyle did not answer for a long moment. At this point, Doyle's own attorney intervened, announcing that his client would be invoking his Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. The room felt that legal maneuver almost as heavily as a confession, because an innocent man rarely hesitates to speak. Yet despite his attorney's advice, Doyle spoke a single short sentence of his own. "There was a fight that night," he said, his voice barely audible. "I lost control, but I never planned a killing. I never planned it." His attorney intervened immediately, preventing his client from saying anything further. But that single sentence hung suspended in the air of the room, neither a full confession nor a denial, only the first fractured piece of a long-buried truth. Foster, the prosecutor who had once risen to defend this very case, now sat in silence, her face carrying not resistance but acceptance. 12 years earlier, while the system wrongly convicted one man, the true perpetrator had been sitting in the most trusted seat in the entire room, the seat of the grieving man mourning the victim. When Foster rose, her voice no longer sounded like that of a prosecutor. "Your Honor," she said, "the state has reviewed this file again, and we must acknowledge that the investigation conducted 12 years ago placed its trust, far too quickly, in the witness who appeared most credible, and that trust, while sending an innocent man to prison, closed off the true investigation from its very first day." This was perhaps the heaviest sentence of the entire case, because no one could point to a single actor who had acted in bad faith. The detectives had followed the standards of their era. The jury had ruled based on the evidence presented to them. The prosecution had built its case on the evidence it possessed. The system, step by step, had followed its own proper procedure, and had still sent the wrong man to prison. Judge Choi's voice was slower than usual as she spoke. "This court cannot comfort itself by blaming a single individual. What we have witnessed here was not an act of individual malice, but trust misplaced, and that may be the most dangerous kind of error of all, because no one ever sounds an alarm to stop it. It was here, precisely, that the deepest truth of the case emerged. The system had functioned flawlessly. Every step had followed procedure, and yet justice had waited at the wrong door for 12 long years. Sometimes the most dangerous failures hide exactly where no rule was ever broken, and no one was ever watching closely enough to notice. Judge Choi's voice was clear as she read her ruling. This court vacates Marcus Webb's conviction, orders his record expunged, and declares him fully exonerated of all charges. The state shall initiate the process of compensation for his period of wrongful imprisonment. When the gavel came down, the sound felt less like a triumph than the settling of a long overdue debt. Marcus turned toward the back rows of the courtroom. There, his 16-year-old daughter had come to witness her father's release for the first time. The look that passed between them needed no words. The young woman walked slowly forward and stepped into her father's arms, with a hesitation built over 12 years. But at last, with complete trust, the courtroom slowly began to empty. As Foster gathered her files, she glanced once toward Marcus and gave a slight nod of her head. Not quite an apology, but the closest thing to one. Doyle, meanwhile, was led out of the room in handcuffs, looking at no one at all. In the courthouse hallway, Emily Carter's mother, Susan Carter, stood quietly between two attorneys. For 12 years, she had lived believing her daughter's killer was behind bars. That belief had been the one stable ground she had built her grief upon. Now, that ground had shifted beneath her in an instant. "I owe Marcus Webb an apology," she said, her voice breaking. "But now I have to grieve all over again, from the very beginning, this time for the right man." When Marcus encountered Susan in the hallway, he carried neither anger nor resentment toward her. He simply extended his hand. Susan hesitated for a moment, then took it firmly. They exchanged only 2 words, "I'm sorry, and I know." A moment that could not undo 12 years of injustice, but could, at last, give it an honest name. The hallway light had turned gold with the last of the afternoon sun. 2 families stood at opposite ends of the same tragedy, both victims and witnesses of the very same system. Reporters waited to photograph the scene, but none of their frames could quite capture the full weight carried in that single handshake. That same week, another name resurfaced. The jailhouse informant who had testified to a supposed confession in the original trial, now a free man himself, admitted in a new interview that his testimony had been fabricated from the start. "I was promised a shorter sentence," he told the cameras. "Marcus never confessed anything to me. I just saw a way out." That admission formally collapsed the third and final pillar the original case had been built upon. Outside the hearing room, a spokesperson for the state's attorney's office issued a brief statement. Ryan Doyle would be formally charged with first-degree murder in connection with Emily Carter's death in 2012. A new case number had already been assigned, and this time the case would proceed far more carefully, far more slowly than it had 12 years before. The irony escaped no one. The man tried in this very courtroom 12 years earlier now walked free. And the man who had once sat confidently in the witness stand that day was now walking toward the defendant's table. The same building, the same courthouse corridors, but the roles had traded places in the most unexpected way imaginable. A reporter, on the courthouse steps, asked Marcus whether he wanted to see Doyle punished. Marcus considered the question for a moment. "I don't hate him," he finally said, "but I want the truth to sit at the right table this time. My share of justice came 12 years too late. His shouldn't be delayed at all." The following morning, the state governor signed an executive order directing the prioritization of untested DNA evidence across all active case files. Some legal commentators had already begun calling it the Webb order. Marcus learned the news over morning coffee, in the kitchen of a small apartment now his own, together with his daughter. An ordinary morning, but exactly the kind of ordinary he had spent 12 years longing for. It was, he would later tell a reporter, the first morning in over a decade that felt entirely, quietly his own. 12 years ago, a system listened to the voice that sounded most convincing, and that voice carried not the truth, but an effort to conceal its own guilt. Marcus Webb's story reminds us that justice is often most fragile in the very moment it feels most certain, because a witness's tears do not always belong to the grieving. Sometimes they belong to the one who killed. In this case, the system, without breaking a single rule, held an innocent man in prison for 12 years. And that same system, without any miracle, through nothing more than the patient march of science, eventually brought the truth to light. Both were true at once, and that duality may be the most unsettling thing we can know about justice itself.